Okay, it seems things are going. So, welcome everybody. This is yet another Cidospel seminar we have organized today, and I am particularly happy to have Rodrigo Nunes here with us for a discussion about his latest book in English, I should say, I suppose, because the latest one is actually in Portuguese and is about Bolsonaro and what it represents. So if we want to discuss later on, it will be in Bologna for a few days. So take advantage, I think I should say, because it's an opportunity. And I just want to say, Rodrigo, the book we are talking about today is titled Neither Vertical nor Horizontal, a Theory of Political Organization. Rita Tagliaventi will say something more about the book in a moment. I just want to say that Rodrigo is an associate professor at the Pontifical Catholic University in Rio de Janeiro, but has been somehow a nomad. Like, he has worked in many, many universities. We met a long time ago, almost 20 years ago in the UK, and since we have kept in touch because we do something similar, and because I think he's a very relevant scholar, contemporary scholar. I really admire your work, Rodrigo. So I leave the floor to Rita for a brief introduction. Then Rodrigo will take 25 to 30 minutes to introduce and discuss some of the concepts you can find in this very rich book. And then Sandro Mezzadra from the University of Bologna. Rita Tagliaventi is from Cidospel as well, so University of Bologna, this very department. And Sandro Mezzadra, still at the University of Bologna, will act as a discussant to open the floor. And then, of course, we can have collective discussion. So, Rita, the floor is yours, and thanks a lot.
Thank you, Emanuele. Thank you, all of you, for participating in this seminar. I am actually quite glad to see that there are a lot of us attending such an interesting meeting on a day like the 1st of July, a very hot day. So I think this is a wonderful outcome of this, your organizing. Emanuele. When Emanuele first contacted me to ask me if I was willing to introduce Rodrigo's book, I told him, well, I'm not a politician at all. I mean, I hardly go beyond listening to talk shows or reading newspapers. So am I the right person to talk about political organizations? And he said, well, I would expect you to deal with the organizational issues contained in Rodrigo's book, which is what I'm going to do. I really enjoyed, by the way, the chance of reading this book. It provides an accurate, exhaustive, in-depth framework on political organizations. It is a complex book, sometimes even demanding for a person like me, who, as I told you, I'm not familiar at all with politics, but I do commend Rodrigo's research. So I hope that you will have a chance of reading it too. What mostly caught my attention in reading the book was the organization word in the title. As I'm convinced that there are a lot of possible positive interfaces, synergies between organization theory in general, which I've been studying for years, and the political organization. And in particular, among the many relevant constructs that Rodrigo raises in his book, which range from self-organization, leadership, ecology, network, organizing cores, I was really focused on the relationship between collective and aggregate, which you also label as potentia and potestas, or molar and molecular, so which together merge into distributed action. On page 79, Rodrigo writes, to be and remain organized, is a matter of relationship between the activities which are being organized and the resistance they are directed against. So this is distributed action as composed, as I said, of these two different actions that are at play altogether, the collective and aggregate, which are coexisting forces that are in a continuous interplay with each other and call for mediation. And I think that mediation is actually a very core concept that the organization theory should take into account further. Remarkably, mediation is here intended as a not as logical opposition, which is the creation of an overarching framework, like, let's say, an organizational identity, but as a continuous search for a frail balance between divergent forces. The issue of divergent forces has been central to organization theory. We are all aware that organizations that we are used to studying them, both private and public organizations, are not homogeneous inside, and they are made of different, sometimes really going opposite ways forces. But in organization theory, I believe that a tendency towards logical opposition rather than taking into account a continuous balance between these divergent forces is prevalent. Although, as I said, we are taught in our organization classes that organizations are made of differences and they are not homogeneous. We have been aiming for a reassuring it is. This organization is X so and so, rather than trying to grasp what the divergent forces within it are. Negotiation, therefore, takes the nuance of building something joint together that is a superordinate identity, by the way, ruling out differences. In 2011, on organizational science, a paper was published by Ashford, Rogers, and Corley that actually put to the fore this tendency towards, let's say, achieving a reassuring end. We are all different, we have different goals, but in the end, by participating in this organization, we can recognize to be something that is shared among all of us. In this paper, which has been very renowned in the international literature, the authors trace a pathway that goes from I think, which is the intrasubjective level, to we think, which is the intersubjective level, to finally going to the aspired endpoint, which is it is, the collective level. This is quite different from the discourse that Rodrigo is going to give us. This is the target, the goal of organizing, as these authors suggest. And as a matter of fact, if we look up websites of companies and organizations, we can really test experience with the goal of getting to it is, instead of we are different and we try to find a balance among us. I just tried to open our website and read that the University of Bologna is the oldest university in the Western world. So it is. What lives, operates, and sometimes struggles, as we now our own experience within the University of Bologna, is totally erased from a definition like this. And similarly, the European Union, if we access the European Union website, we can read up front, the European Union is a unique economic and political union between 27 European countries. So that's why I think that actually Rodrigo's contribution is so valuable to organization studies, because it takes a totally different point of view, saying that we have to search a balance between divergent forces that are not ruled out by a common shared definition like this. Whereas the organization theory I'm familiar with, as I said, chosen a different viewpoint and try to strive for a happy end, who we are as a whole. And I would like Rodrigo to explore further and tell us more about all his book, and in particular, if you could try to clarify even better this concept of potency and potestas, collective and aggregate. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Maria Rita. Just for the sake of people listening from home.
Let's switch seats.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much. Please, Rodrigo. Now that we are sure that Bologna is the oldest university, okay? No, because we were joking about that, Maria Rita, before. Exactly, yeah.
I was going to, when you said that, I was going to ask Sandro, isn't there a post-colonial critique of this claim?
I guess so. You know, it's a contested kind of claim. Like a couple of universities in Spain, even Morocco,
No, I was reporting about the controversy, of course, although
when you invite people, you try to convince American universities to fund initiatives at the University of Bologna, then it's good marketing.
If you bring me to a room with like frescoes in the ceiling, I'm gonna believe you're all. I'm easily impressed like that. So first of all, thank you all very much for coming. I know it's July and it's hot, so I really appreciate the effort. If I had more time, I would actually love to try and do this talk in Italian. I speak Italian, but I haven't spoken in almost 15 years. But feel free to ask questions in Italian later if that's more comfortable for you. Since I can't guarantee the results if I try to speak in Italian now, I think it's safer if I go for English. And thank you so much to Lele for organizing this, and to Maria Rita and Sandro for being my discussants today. This is the greatest concentration of copies of the book that I've seen on the table so far. One of the things of publishing a book during a global pandemic is you don't actually get to see it in bookshops, especially if you publish in English and you happen to be in Brazil or Australia, as was the case for me for at least part of the time.
But it's quite easy to download the book from.
I mean, I can neither condemn nor condone this statement, but I hear it is. Let's just say that. So the work I was trying to do with this book was the kind of intervention that I was trying to do with this book was an intervention that worked at once on a negative and a positive level. what I mean by a negative level is something that we could describe as a therapeutic intervention in the sense that Ludwig Wittgenstein uses that word. So a work of conceptual therapy, because I had come to realize over time that a lot of the conceptual grammars on which we relied to discuss ideas like organization, self-organization, spontaneity, leadership, and so on, were, on the one hand, often contradictory, and on the other hand, often highly problematic and filled with problematic assumptions that because we just assumed those conceptual grammars, because we just took them ready-made from tradition, we never questioned. So on the one hand, part of what I wanted to do was to look at these conceptual grammars and say, there's something wrong here. There's something that doesn't work here. And having identified that something was wrong and having identified what it was that was wrong, what it was that was causing us problems within those conceptual grammars, then propose a new grammar in which to pose the same problems. So this is why it is a theory of political organization, because I thought actually the best way of trying to intervene in this debate is to try and start from scratch. Let's just build a theory of organization from the beginning, because in this way we can avoid all these received ideas that create problems for us without us even being aware that they're creating as problems, and also hopefully build a common language that people will then be able to discuss political organization in. And that's one of the best bits of feedback that I've had in the book since it came out just about a month ago, I think, 2 months ago. I had this Zoom call with a bunch of housing organizers in the US who had read the book as part of a reading group. And that was one of the things that they told me, that, you know, this has given us a language to talk about several things that we just couldn't talk about before because we didn't have the language for that. So it's been really useful for us in that sense, which obviously I count as a major win because that was one of the things that I wanted this book to do. So this, what I just said, kind of describes the method that I was more or less unconsciously or consciously working with while I was writing this book. I describe it as moving upstream and downstream, where downstream is lots of practical problems that I've encountered in my own practice or, you know, through other people's experiences, through accounts of social movements in different places. And upstream was the conceptual origin of these problems. It seemed to me that if you could move back upstream and identify, okay, if we change this way of posing the problem, then the practical problem ceases to occur, or the practical problem appears in a different way, or we have a different way to pose that practical problem. It seemed to me that it was possible to make this movement. And this is why it is, the book is a bit of a weird beast in the sense that it's not a book on organizing, it's a book on how to think about organizing. It's not a book on strategy, it's a book on how to think about strategy, because it felt to me that it was possible to develop a coherent theoretical framework in which these things could be thought anew in ways that would then facilitate the posing of practical problems by people doing organizing, people thinking strategy, and so on. The starting point for me was to question a number of assumptions about organization and what the question of organization means, or what kind of question is the question of organization, or what the question of organization is trying to answer. Last week I was in Berlin giving 3 talks, and I could make lots of jokes about the Organisationsfrage. I imagine in Italian it's just called la domanda dell'organizzazione, la questione. Yeah, so not as fun to say as Organisationsfrage. But so some of the assumptions that I was trying to question were, first of all, the idea that political organization proper is something rare, or that there is a radical break between political organization proper and what is pre-political or unorganized. So the idea that political organization only begins for real once a certain level of deliberation and consciousness is crossed. Funnily enough, this is an assumption that's actually shared by both horizontalist and verticalist camps. So, you know, if you think of a classic orthodox account of what political organization is, you have the pre-political expression of social unrest. You have the working class organizing to fight economic struggles through trade unions. But the real telos of political organization is the working class crossing the threshold of consciousness, after which they realize that actually their end goal is to fight for political power, and thus giving themselves the instrument with which to fight for political power, which is the party. So the idea is that political organization begins for real with the party. Now, this is not something that horizontalists question a lot of the time. They just think this structure with inverted signs. You know, verticals would say political organization begins for real with the party, and that's what we should strive for. Whereas horizontals would say political organization inevitably is the party, so we should avoid organization at all costs because we want to avoid the party. Now, there is one way to bypass that problem from being posed in either one of those ways, which is to say, actually, this threshold is not as clear-cut as both sides assume. And one of the questions that has been asked of me since I finally managed to start touring this book, which was only like 2 weeks ago, 1 year after it came out, was, well, but what exactly is the political then? And my answer to that is, well, I think the political is a fuzzy concept. It doesn't have very well-defined borders. So it's better to err on the side of not trying to define too much. Because, you know, if you define too much, then you end up excluding a bunch of things from the political and calling them pre-political, unorganized. It's better to err on the side of caution and allow for looser boundaries than trying to define too much. I wanted to go in the opposite direction. I wanted to argue that organization is everywhere all the time. Anything that we can speak of is organized in some way. Therefore, and you know, this amounts, or this applies to the party, but it also applies to a bunch of people who've just started collaborating informally. Okay, if you can describe these people as a bunch of people who are collaborating informally in a political project, what you are describing is an emergent pattern of organization. This is not no organization. This is some form of organization that is in the process of emerging. And I wanted the language of organization to be able to cover that entire spectrum of possibilities. One consequence of saying that organization is everywhere is that it cannot be identified with any particular form that it can take. The party, the trade union, the collective, the network, all organizational forms are organization, which means that the question of organization cannot be a prescriptive question. One unwritten assumption in most discussions of the question of organization is the assumption that what the question of organization is trying to answer is, what is the ideal form of organization? What is the form of organization that we should have? Or what is the form of organization that everyone should have? Or, at the limit, what is the organization that everyone should belong to, which is the party? One consequence of the way I was approaching the problem was that the question of organization cannot be a question of prescribing the ideal form of political organization, but rather it must take into account all the different forms that exist in their different degrees of stabilization, in different spatial and temporal scales, and the relations that exist among these forms. So political organization is not then synonymous with conscious, deliberate organization, and particularly not with the kind of conscious and deliberate organization that you would find within the party, or that you would supposedly only find within the party. It's not a kingdom within a kingdom, to use Spinoza's phrase, but it's governed by dynamics that are not conscious or decided upon by anyone, which then makes possible the resort to scientific discourses on self-organization. So in a way, one of the counterintuitive consequences of the approach that I was choosing is that a theory of organization is a subsection of a theory of self-organization rather than the other way around. What I mean by that is the universe is self-organized. The universe self-organizes according to dynamics that can be described both in philosophical and scientific theory, and I helped myself to a bunch of them. I helped myself to the work of Alexander Bogdanov, for example, or Spinoza, Gilbert Simondon, Deleuze and Guattari, but also cybernetics, thermodynamics, what else? Network theory. I was helping myself to all these different discourses on self-organization to make more conscious, deliberate forms of organization appear as a part of that, rather than exhausting the field of what organization is. The idea there was then that a theory of political organization must start from a theory of organization in a broader sense. And this has a number of important consequences. For example, an important consequence for what we mean by spontaneity. Usually in the grammar that we use, in the conceptual grammar that we use to talk about organization and spontaneity are considered to be the opposite of one another, if you take spontaneity to be synonymous with self-organization, this creates the paradox that self-organization, which should by right be a form of organization, is the opposite of organization, which means that organization is what you call organization in opposition to self-organization is then actually hetero organization. It's organization by an other, from an other, organization coming from the outside. And this is one of the things that I question in the book. I question this presupposition of easily drawn boundaries between inside and outside that this grammar of self-organization and spontaneity suppose. In the way that I'm posing the problem, spontaneity, or what is spontaneous, is not unorganized, because everything is organized in its own way. The spontaneous is always organized in its own way. Spontaneity refers to the emergence of organization and not the absence of it. In the same way that self-organization refers to the emergence of constraints and not the absence of constraints. To be organized is to operate under constraints. And how am I doing for time?
10, 15 minutes if you want.
Okay. Good Lord. God help me.
I will give you when it's 5 minutes, I'll let you know.
Okay. But yeah, let's say I try to wrap up in 10 minutes at most. Okay. So another misconception about self-organization, to me, it seemed, was that self-organization would be the absence of constraints, because this grammar that I was just criticizing leads us to think that constraints always come from outside. So if something is self-organized, there wouldn't be any constraints. And what I wanted to point out is to be organized is to operate under constraints. For example, and this is an example I always use because it's I think quite intuitive. Towards the end of 2012 in Brazil, there was a conflict, a land conflict going on between big landowners and the Guarani Kaiowá people in the Midwest of Brazil. It was in the news for a little bit. Some people knew about it. One day, someone, somewhere, to this day, I've never seen any account of this, and it's clearly not important who did that, but someone decided to add the words Guarani Kaiowá to their names on social media. And then lots of people started doing that. Suddenly, loads of people had done that, and through doing that, had drawn attention to the conflict going on between the landowners and the Guarani Kaiowá. And through that, obviously, indirectly, put some pressure in politicians in the area, in the judiciary, etc. So that did create some political effect. Even as simple a gesture as just changing your name was capable of producing some political effect. Now, that's not an absence of organization. An absence of organization would be nothing happening. Everyone changing their name to Guarani Kaiowá is the emergence of a very simple pattern of organization. And obviously, the kinds of patterns, the patterns of organization we need to change the world will necessarily be a lot more complex than that one. But that's the emergence of a very simple pattern of organization. And that is the emergence of constraints. The constraints in this case the constraints are very simple, is adding Guarani Kaiowá to your name on social media, and probably also from that point on, dedicating some part of your day to reading about what was going on in Mato Grosso do Sul, and sharing information about it with other people. Now, you weren't doing that before. No one or very few people were doing that before this pattern emerged. Now they were dedicating a part of their day to doing this. So this is a form of constraint. You know, instead of doing whatever, now you're doing this one thing that is required of you in order to participate in this, in this, however you want to call it, collective process that was taking place. So this is what I mean when I say organization always implies constraints. This is an entirely self-organized process by which people gave themselves constraints, and the process could happen because people were giving themselves constraints. So again, self-organization is not the absence of constraints. Self-organization is the emergence of constraints. And once they have emerged, then people can look at them and reflect, okay, are these constraints sufficient? Do we need greater constraints? Do the greater constraints we need require a formal organization? And this is where more conscious and deliberate forms of organization develop from, but all these things exist in a spectrum with one another. And I felt that a theory of political organization had to be capable of talking about this entire spectrum rather than focusing on a single organizational form like the party. The other major consequence of this approach, and I think this is probably the most important takeaway message from the book, is, well, if you think organization always supposes a plurality, therefore, organization is not contained within any particular organization or within any particular organizational form, but also organization is the spontaneous, or organization follows from the spontaneous emergence of constraints, then actually organization must be always thought within an organizational ecology. There's always plural organizational forms, but there's also plural forms of organization or of organizing going on within an ecology. You have the organization that exists within organizations, but you have the organization that takes place between organizations. You have the relations that happen among people who aren't affiliated to any organizations. You have the relationships between these people who are unaffiliated and the organizations within whose sphere of influence they are, and so on and so forth. Which means that the question of organization then ceases to be a question about how or what is the ideal organizational form, because now you're supposing there's always going to be more than one organizational form, and the question becomes a question of how to make the most of an existing ecology. How do you make the best use of the ecology that you have? If you think about it, the way of posing, and I make this observation in the book, that the golden age of the political party coincides with the golden age of the vertically integrated company. You know, at the same time that in which capitalism was organized by the idea of bringing everything in-house. You know, you have one company that does every step of the process. The party was the organizational form that was ultimately supposed to bring everything in-house. The party was the organizational form that was supposed to be the general umbrella for the entire organizational ecology. Ultimately, social movements, reading groups, trade unions, etc., everything would be feeding into this larger umbrella. Now, to think of organization in ecological ways means precisely thinking of an ecology in which the functions that in the past were supposed to be contained or within a single organization are dispersed across an ecology. You have different groups performing different functions, both politically, but also in terms of practical specialization. Like there are some people who do legal support. There are other people who do, some people do legal support. Other people go out on a boat on the Mediterranean and try to rescue people who are drowning at sea. And you don't need those. You don't necessarily need those two functions to be in-house. You can, if you have an ecology in which there are different groups fulfilling those functions, but these groups are connected, then you may have a solution that works. Now, the point of making that move towards ecology is not, and I think this is possibly the most original theoretical move in the book, if I may say so. I know it sounds not very modest to say that, but I say that because I imagine at this point, many people will be thinking, oh yes, we heard this before. It's the multitude. It's the movement versus the party. I think the important difference here is an ecology is not to talk about ecology is not simply to talk about dispersion. It's not to oppose centralization with dispersion. It's not to oppose the one with the multiple. Why? Because an ecology is not just dispersed. An ecology is integrated. More importantly, an ecology may have different levels or different degrees of integration. So the question is actually that of giving the ecology greater degrees of integration, which means that to say an ecology has different degrees of integration is ultimately to say it's neither one nor simply multiple. It is a multiple that has different ones inside. So you have different nodes within the ecology that will be more important than others at different times. You have nodes of the ecology that play a greater role in terms of connecting different parts of the ecology, but also in terms of leadership, which is one of the old words that I try to give a new meaning to in the book, or maybe just free the meaning we became used to giving to them from all the metaphysical baggage that had become, accumulated over the years. So I would say to close that, in fact, not only was my intention with introducing this concept of organization ecology, not to simply defend dispersion, diversity, and plurality, or unilaterally affirm dispersion, diversity, and plurality over concentration, homogeneity, and unity. The main goal of the book was to try and find a way out a way out of this opposition, which struck me for a long time as a completely sterile opposition. This extreme opposition between two poles that you were supposed to choose between. Actually, any existing network in the natural world is always a combination of those two poles. It's neither completely centralized nor completely decentralized. It's neither completely heterogeneous nor completely homogeneous. And the question, part of the question of how to make the most of an ecology then becomes precisely how to reconcile those two opposing tendencies or those two opposing poles in the constitution of the ecology that one is working with. How to reconcile and what are the trade-offs included in, for example, seeking the advantages of greater autonomy for the parts of the ecology, or seeking greater unity. And these are problems, these are questions, the question of calibration between these opposites, the question of the trade-offs involved between these opposites are questions that are posed continuously within an ecology. This is not, so I'm not just asking for, oh, what is a good average between the two? If only we could find a good average between the two things, then we have the best of both worlds. Actually, there is no good average, or there is no permanent good average, because you're always operating with a changing ecology and you're always operating within a changing world. So you're having to constantly seek new conditions of equilibrium. Ultimately, then what I'm saying is the question of organization doesn't have an answer. It doesn't have an answer that you could give once and for all, precisely because it's not about finding an ideal form. It's about finding conditions of equilibrium within a balance of forces given inside an organizational ecology that allows you to both make the most of the possibilities for political action within it, without running the risk of too much power accumulating in certain nodes, too much centralization becoming an inhibiting factor for the action of the parts, so on and so forth. Yes, this strikes me. As you can tell, I knew how to start, but I didn't know how to end. So I'll just end here, which is as good a place as any other for someone who doesn't have an exact idea where to end. So that was it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, that's a change. Thank you, Sandro.
So thank you, Rodrigo. Thank you for your speech today, but above all, thank you for writing this book, which is a sophisticated and fresh contribution to a topic, political organization, that is too often disavowed or oversimplified within the left writ large and even within social movements. So I really hope this book will nurture a lot of discussions that, of course, will also lead toward unplanned directions. This is part of the game, and this is what makes the discussion of such a book productive.
I read this book also thinking of its political background, which means Rodrigo's participation in the experience of Horitonzal. I remember 2004 in London, the European Social Forum, this space beyond the ESF, that was a horizontal space, and horizontalism was the word of the day. Yeah. But then, of course, I also read the book, as Rodrigo suggests to do, against the background of 2011, which means the uprisings in North Africa, and then 15 of May in Spain, and the political cycles of Occupy. A cycles that, ranged from Auckland to New York, from Hong Kong, then to Brazil, to Turkey, maybe to Kiev with Euromaidan. And I think it would be quite interesting to discuss Euromaidan within the wider framework of the movements and struggles of 2011, 2013. Those movements and those struggles nurtured once again, for example, the notion of leaderless movements. But those struggles and movements, in a way, failed in many parts of the world. I mentioned Ukraine, but think of Egypt, think of Syria, think of Libya, think of Hong Kong. So against the background of this failure of defeat of the movements, there was a huge debate on the need to rediscover the party. After 2013, the party was a big notion, with people like Slavoj Žižek, currently a fan of NATO, or Jody Dean, or this strange Italian gay Mimmo Porcari. Nobody knows him in Italy, but he's very famous in Germany, because of transport and this kind of stuff. So you find him in Rodrigo's book. Anyway, I like very much the way in which Rodrigo tackles this political conjunction and the problem that this political conjunction raises. As you heard already, Rodrigo proposes to go beyond the binaries that have for a long time framed the discussion of organization. Spontaneity against organization. This binary is usually led back to what is to be done by Lenin. The provisional title of Rodrigo's project was Networked Leninism. And I guess this implies a specific reading of what is to be done. A reading that emphasizes the fact that there is a kind of self-empowering relationship between spontaneity and organization in that book. So in a completely different kind of framework, Rodrigo attempts to restart that virtuous circle that in a way was broken even in thought in later years. And this is something I find particularly thought-provoking. But there are also other binaries, for instance, micro and macro politics, molecular and molar. This just that circulated a lot in the last couple of decades, and that has often obscured, in a way, the problems, the political problems we are confronted with, more than it has contributed to advance in confronting that problem. So a theory of organization beyond a whole set of binaries, a way out of bipolarity. Having said this, a couple of remarks on what I think are important questions raised by the book. One has not been mentioned until now, and it is the question of revolution. Rodrigo devotes a whole chapter in the book to the discussion of the concept of revolution. And of course, he joins important writers like Reinhard Koselleck, for instance, in demonstrating that the modern notion of revolution is predicated upon the modern understanding of historical time through the notion of progress, put it shortly. And this is untenable from many angles, and in particular from the angle of the climate crisis that confronts us with a totally different notion of time. So I find this interesting and compelling. I also agree with Rodrigo on the fact that we have to go beyond yet another binary opposition, which means the opposition between reform and revolution, at least provisionally. The notion of fitness that Rodrigo develops in the last chapter of the book points precisely in this direction. Rodrigo speaks of the need to reconcile radicality and realism in an attempt to seek the maximum change possible within existing constraints. This is a good definition of what you call fitness. So my question is, what about the radical limits that all exercises in fitness from Spain to Latin America have encountered over the last couple of decades? To put it concretely, I think of progressive Latin American governments in Venezuela, in Bolivia, in Ecuador, in Argentina, in Brazil, that in a way, I mean, can be considered as embodying this idea of fitness, but all these governments encountered radical limits in their attempt to seek the maximum change possible within existing constraints. should we provisionally reframe the question of revolution in terms of an attempt to smash those limits? Or should we consider the latter, those limits, as part of what Rodrigo calls existing constraints? In other words, which is the position of the notion of revolution today? You were talking before of organization as an attempt to create an equilibrium within a balance of forces. But organization, at least sometimes, has also to smash balances of forces in order to open up the spaces that make change possible. Just the last point, everything is organized. Organization is a kind of ontological principle in your work. Well, it is easy to understand that people can ask you which is the specific aspect of political organization. You were mentioning that before. And I would like to push you a bit on this question. The distinction between potentia and potestas was mentioned before. Of course, it is a distinction that we can find in Spinoza, and that was very much emphasized and introduced into critical debates by Toni Negri in his first great book on Spinoza, The Savage Anomaly, 1981, written in jail. In a way, I have the impression, reading the book, that this is the only binary whose dissolution you somehow, even unintentionally, resist. It's the idea of potestas as a threat. Well, as a threat to potentia. Potentia, just to put it in a few words, is the power to do things, the power to act, while potestas is the power over others. But we cannot renounce potestas in a theory of political organization. You were saying, you were right in saying before that the political is a fuzzy concept, and I agree with you. But a way to define, to provisionally define the political from the angle of a theory of organization is precisely to emphasize the need to build a collective power that is nurtured by a collective potentia that is not destroyed by the operations of power. I think this is, I put it in a very abstract way, but it is absolutely concrete. You know, it is absolutely concrete. In a way, you can say that this is the relationship between movements, between struggles on the one hand, and established powers from organizations like parties to institutions. Power on the one hand, potentia on the other hand, potency on the other hand. Struggles, movements can be read in terms of potentia. And you have the problem that is a historical problem, a vexed question in theories of organization of the relation between these two aspects. So, second question to you is, what is the role of Protestants, of power in your understanding of organization? You know, this is a question that many of us have tried to tackle over the last years, rethinking, for instance, the notion of counter power, rethinking dualism of power, rethinking institutions, because this is another big question that looms behind any discussion of organization. So I conclude with a third remark, question to Rodrigo. At the very beginning of the book, in the introduction, you anticipate the accusation of formalism or excessive abstraction. Good move, I mean, rhetorical, of course, you know. Nevertheless, I must say that while reading the book, I missed a bit, not that much concrete instances, but rather attempts to test your key concepts against the background of material experiences of organization. Because, you know, and I conclude, everything is organized. I find it very interesting. So I'm not. The question is quite obvious. What is the specific aspect of a political organization? One said this. There are very different types of organizations, as you remind in the book. And I have the impression that your theoretical framework is a kind of catch-all framework. You have a party, I would put it in very concrete terms. You have a union, an established union, CGL, or a grassroots union, SICOBAS. Quite different, you know. You have a committee struggling in a neighborhood. You have big movements like Friday for Future or the trans-feminist movement. You know, Ni Una Menos in Argentina, Non Una di Meno in Italy, big movements. All these movements are organized, of course, but the question of organization posits itself in very different ways in each of these instances of organization. I think that maybe you will write a second volume in a way taking into account the possibility and I would say the theoretical productivity of this move of pitting the concepts against concrete material practices of organization that are, as you perfectly know, quite heterogeneous. Okay, and thanks a lot.
Okay, that was great, at least in my opinion. We have half an hour, if you want a little bit more, for discussing. So if there are questions, remarks, comments, please just raise your hands, of course. The same goes for people following via Teams. And well, I mean, while we wait for someone to step up, I will just make it, well, an awfully brief comment, but we will actually.
No.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't want to say that at first, because I mean, Sandro's last remark was also going to be my starting point, because I mean, but I will take it in another direction, of course, because my impression is that, at least from my perspective, the usefulness of this book goes in two ways. One, and I hope there will be the opportunity to further explore this one on Monday. There's a book launch, the same book at Modo Info Shop, and hopefully with the activists. And I think there are some climate activists here as well, so I can just at least introduce the issue. And for example, like all the chapter 5 and 6 of your book are particularly useful to test how an organizational ecology can work within the climate movement. Because I mean, if you look at how leadership is distributed internationally and mediatically, you see, like, there's Greta, of course. Greta is a media leader. Okay, she has no say, and she doesn't want to have, as far as as far as we know, any say about national organization, like, the organizational path that tribes on national terms are undertaking. And then you have, for example, the link between the climate justice movement and the transfeminist movement. In look at the distributed leadership of the climate movement, you won't find men. It's young women leading those movements, although, for example, then in different national chapters, you can find within the assemblies, okay, young male stepping up and in any case be part of the game. So it was particularly useful for me to self-reflect on how the climate justice movement is organized. Although I must say, the part I really felt touched my experience was a little bit of a in-between lines, which is like, you, especially in chapter 4, you basically say, okay, let's assume historically the relationship between the crisis of Marxism on the one hand, okay, post-68, the rise of post-structuralism, and the diffusion, the spread of complexity theory. Because I mean, on my experience as a Marxist scholar, as a scholar activist or something like that, I am actually I went through phases in which, either you talked about Foucault or Deleuze, or you were out of what was happening. And quite suddenly, in between 2011 2014, the complete opposite happened. And right now, if you actually try to make, a critical point, like, critical in the sense, like, not saying either it's great or it's terrible. Like, if you try to be a serious scholar, if you want, about post-structuralism, you just are labeled as a, come on. Then you accept that we don't talk about power, that we don't talk about, organization and stuff like that. And I think you make a huge contribution in explaining in historical terms how the three lines interacted and how we can actually save the baby and let the bathwater go. And it really was like, I have never had the courage or the means, if you want, to tackle directly this point. Like, I just tried in a review I wrote to, in France, the big thing was the first book edited by Daniel Zamora, Poton critiquer Foucault, and then Poton critiquer Foucault was the title of the Ballast and then Jacobin USA interview. And my strategy, not too dissimilar from yours, at least partly, was actually to go and look at political composition of those movements in 68, from, in Italy from 68 to 77. And I was particularly happy to see that you actually discussed Gortz's farewell to the working class, not smashing it, like, having actually read it and, like, trying to, which was an attempt, if you want, an immature one, to deal with the changing political composition. Okay, so the point was the non-class of non-producer or non-class of non-workers was precisely an attempt to deal with how the working class was changing, for example, with the crisis of the vertically integrated enterprise. So just wanted to say that you didn't mention this aspect, but I think it's one of the greatest achievement of the book. And then right now, let's see if other people want to contribute to the discussion. If not, of course, you have Rita and Sandro's points, so plenty of stuff to work on. Please, Nick, would you mind coming here so that people, either here or even like, if you want to stand still, you can stay here, but just to get closer to the mic. So as you prefer, if you want to sit.
No. So thank you. I didn't read the book already, so my question is related to what you basically said today. And my question refers to the use of the metaphor of ecology for thinking organization, which on one hand, I think it's a useful provocation for going beyond the vertical and the horizontal metaphor. That is a challenge that I agree with. On the other hand, I think that, and this is partially juxtaposed to one of Sandro's questions, ecology, as far as I know, is based on the need to survive and reproduction, while political organization, as far from me, is about pointing to one enemy or many enemies and to organize accordingly to the way in which you want to fight against these enemies. So an ecology should have a common aim and a common enemy to become somehow a revolutionary organization. Related to this, within the metaphor of the ecology, you said it's a sort of networked organization with different form, with different hierarchies, if I can mobilize this conception. So my question about this is, who does the integration of the network? Because if we think this ecology is a sort of self-evolving form, it seems to me that we need to adopt a metaphor that is quite similar to the concept of the market, you know, a sort of self-organized system that self-reproduces. So if we think ecology in terms of organization, there is someone who should work for like doing the connections, and doing the connections means somehow organizing with the aim of something. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Niccolò. There's another question. Marco Deseris from Teams, and then Alberto here. Marco, the floor is yours. If you want to turn on the camera, that's great. If not, no problem.
Okay. Yeah, you cannot see me, right?
We can't, I would say.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I think it's my problem. Hi, Rodrigo. We met a long time ago, about 10 years ago, I believe, at 16 Beaver, at the time of Occupy Wall Street, more or less, I think. So yes, thank you. I just ordered your book, so I have to read it. But two questions came to mind as I was listening to you. The first one is about the intentionality of the actors who participate in this neither vertical nor horizontal organizations. That is, it seems to me that you are taking almost like formalistic approach that steps out and looks at networks, intersections of networks and parties. But if you step in, if you take on a subjective position, you will see that those who say have a modern view of politics, who come from a Marxist-Leninist tradition, will want to organize, to structure the movements, the networks toward a vertical form. I'm thinking, for example, about Jody Dean's book, Crowd and Party, and the type of intervention she tries to make on Occupy Wall Street. Those instead come from an anarchist, say, tradition, will want to work toward horizontalism. This is to say that the two poles, when you look at them from a subjective position, still hold for me That is, the type of organizing work can go in one direction or the other. And this leads me to the second question about, which is connected to Sandro's intervention on power to versus power over. I think that in a neither vertical nor horizontal organization, the two tend to coincide. That is, as you say, in a bottom-up type of organization, we do have constraints. I need you and you need me, and we need to also trust each other and delegate power to each other. So this is a power two, but also as we know, in networks, the more distributed they are also, the more certain forms of authority and leadership tend to emerge. Now, this is not necessarily a problem. I'm thinking, for example, about also feminist approach to autoritativeness, right? Autorevolezza, as we say in Italian, right? So that kind of dichotomy could also be solved by saying those who have power over are also those who have power too, because I recognize them the power to take decisions on my behalf. So I was wondering whether you could address these two issues that are related to one another. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. Alberto, you want to pose your questions, and then I will read the question by Giulia Righetti through Teams.
Io approfitto della tua disponibilità a parlare italiano. Volevo provare a porre due questioni. Una, riprendo il tentativo di test che diceva Sandro, particolarmente sul movimento sul quale sto provando a lavorare, che è Extinction Rebellion, che mi sembra molto interessante, cioè rispetto al quale mi sembra molto interessante il tuo framework del libro, che ho letto parzialmente, però. E sostanzialmente perché costruisce una strategia top-down proprio a partire dall'esperienza di Occupy, ma ponendosi una serie di altre questioni senza idealizzarlo, e perché ora, soprattutto nell'ultimo anno, quindi anche in seguito all'uscita del libro, si stanno verificando delle proliferazioni di campagne, soprattutto nel Regno Unito, diciamo laterali a Extinction Rebellion, che rendono interessante il pensare come ecologia la stessa forma organizzativa. Io provo, quello che è la mia aspirazione, è leggerla con le 3 ecologie di Guattari, dove credo che un elemento di ecologia mentale particolarmente relativo all'aspetto mediatico, quindi come l'aspetto mediatico entra nella soggettività, sia utile in questo senso. Io ti volevo chiedere se conosci quanto conosci questo movimento e se hai una lettura in questo senso, ponendo poi un'altra questione molto breve, perché diciamo mi ha molto risuonato con alcune questioni che nel mio piccolo ho provato a pormi anni fa, soprattutto studiando l'ondata spagnola insieme a Podemos, eccetera. Attraverso Negri, la riappropriazione del capitale fisso, quel tipo di aspetto, cioè quindi legato alla tecnologia, alle nuove tecnologie, ai media, e però mi è servito anche Castells, perché fa un'operazione molto semplice di tendenziale sovrapposizione di comunicazione e organizzazione. Lui è stato probabilmente l'ultimo tecno-entusiasta in questo senso, e anche lui ha smesso in una certa misura, non solo perché ora fa il ministro, ma perché scrisse questo librettino, non credo tradotto oltre allo spagnolo, che si chiama Ruptura, molto breve, al contrario dei suoi libri, sulla rottura di senso legato a post-verità, fake news. Ora, io credo che in tutto questo, tutti questi binarismi che te giustamente sottolinei da cercare di rompere, ci sia utile la logica mediatica della polarizzazione, per comprendere come mai nel pensare la teoria di organizzazione oggi siamo portati, in realtà da un punto di vista di soggettivazione politica, a collocarci in una parte orizontalista o in una parte verticalista. E volevo chiederti se questa cosa della polarizzazione, che nella sconfinata letteratura che hai mobilitato, diciamo, è una parte più legata agli studi proprio sui media, che magari non hai toccato, se ti sembra congruo.
Just when you say polarization, what do you have in mind?
Like,
You can say if you can give me examples.
Un esempio classico sul discorso scientifico, anche prima della pandemia, sui vaccini, la tematica tende a, diciamo, soltanto i poli estremi esprimono opinioni, le opinioni intermedie spariscono, come logica, direte, di mediatizzazione.
Francesca, so just a second, I read Giulia's question here so that you can take note, and then Francesca takes the floor. So she says she hasn't read the book yet, but still wanted to ask if you have dialogued with, I suppose she means Pierre Cluster reflections. If it is actually Paul Cluster, Giulia, I don't know who he is, but in any case, if it is Pierre, it's okay. Yeah, I think so. Francesca?
I have some notes. Thank you for your speech. I would like to interact evocating the concept of convergence, which is, I can say, especially in Italy, the word of the year for activists, especially in our field, because we assist, or better, some of us also contribute to create this merging among climate justice movements, students' movements, trans-feminist movements, and also workers' struggle. Under this claim, this flag of convergence of struggles. I would like to ask you if this kind of narrative and also practical claim can be operative in the reconstruction of a grammar to approach political organization, because I can say we assist to not a unique but a disruptive and peculiar way to hybridate languages, practices, and perspectives to empower this global critique against capitalism, to fight capitalism. This is a peculiar Italian case, I can say, along this here, and it resounds me when you mentioned the previous title of your book, Network Leninism, for the way in which these kind of practices and narratives interrelate each other.
Thank you so much, Francesca. I would say Luca also is.
Nel tuo discorso e nel dispositivo anche analitico che proponi, come possiamo leggere le vicende legate all'opposizione alla guerra negli ultimi anni? Adesso, no, in questa fase degli ultimi mesi, comparandole con le esperienze dei primi 2000, dei movimenti contro la guerra, e quindi vedere come la lettura del fenomeno guerra sia iscrivibile in questa polarizzazione dicotomica, binaria, quanto possa rafforzarla e quanto potremmo invece modificare la lettura del fenomeno per decostruire questa cosa. In Italia è abbastanza evidente, per esempio, che in questi mesi non si è espresso un movimento con una posizione precisa, o perlomeno che aiutasse all'azione. Non so, su questo tema, e per esempio
Adesso per me che politicamente anche sono nato invece quando c'erano le mobilitazioni nei primi 2000, è un'esperienza straniante, devo dire, al di là della valutazione politica.
Grazie Luca. Okay, then you have 9. Sorry.
Very, very short.
Please.
Thank you so much, Riccardo, and thank you for organizing this. Because you already had a question on the ecology metaphor, I was wondering, I mean, was that really a metaphor? I mean, I also haven't read the book yet. And because, for instance, no, I was wondering whether, do you mean political organization as, within the autonomy of the social, let's say, like it's just a matter of social relations and organizing the social? Or are you also concerned in the book with material organizing, as other scholars have been? In that sense, I would be curious, because in that sense, for me, then the title for this talk would be maybe more not so much organizing on the ruins, but organizing the ruins. I was curious, whether that is in your mind or in your book or not. I hope I can read it anyway.
Thank you so much, Pietro. And then you have 8 full minutes now.
Oh, wow. Okay.
No, I think
This is what places.
yeah, sure. Take the time you need, and then
Okay, so
15
first
past.
of all, Lilith, lock the doors. Don't let anyone out. I'm done. There's lots of excellent questions. It's just so good to be able, after a whole year of the book being out, it's just so good to be able to be in a room with people who are interested in discussing it and come up with such excellent questions, some of which I think I can clarify. Others, like the ones Sandro raised, are really thorny. But I'll try, which hopefully I can clarify a little bit as well. But I'll try to start with the ones that I can clarify. First of all, perhaps the easiest one, the one on Pierre Clastre. I do actually, there's a whole section of the book in which I am discussing Pierre Clastre, and I'm discussing it against or alongside Machiavelli, which I think lots of Clastrians would find weird, but maybe not so much Machiavellians. I think there's an interesting dialogue between that can be established between Clastre and the Republican tradition of Machiavelli. So it's a very, usually Clastre is someone who's just taken up by horizontalists to say, oh, you see, we were right all along. And I want to argue that it's a bit more complicated than that, but also more interesting, I would say. On the issue of convergence, I think, no, let me save that for, because I think there are 3 questions that I can group together. So let me jump to those. First of all, the question of ecology as metaphor and whether it is a metaphor. It's a good question, to what extent it is a metaphor. I would like it not to be one. But it is, but then the idea of ecology needs adapting in this context. And I think the question, for example, the question of material organization is definitely the question. I mean, I don't have much to say about it in the book, but it is definitely something I am talking about in the book without going into it with too much detail. But so if it's not a metaphor, or even if it is, it needs to be adapted to the context in which we're using it. And I think you highlighted very well the ways in which it would need to be adapted. And I think Marco's question was also pointing in this direction. First of all, you said, well, but in an ecology, everyone, each individual actor is, basically interested in surviving and reproducing, whereas in an organizational ecology, on top of surviving and reproducing, which is both an interest that the people involved in organizations have individually, but also an interest that organizations have to a greater or lesser extent, surviving and reproducing. But on top of that, there's something else. You're not just surviving and reproducing, you're trying to change the world. You're trying to fight capitalism, you're trying to fight or the power of capital and the state, etc. So your question was, shouldn't there be a common name? And yes, there should be. The question is, what do we mean by common aim? And one of the things that I'm trying to do with this suggestion of framing organizational questions and political questions in ecological terms is precisely to point out to people commonality comes in degrees. You don't need complete consensus in order to be marching alongside most of the people who are out there. So if there is a part of the way that you can march with others, that's great. That's good enough. Once you get there, at least none of you will be in the same place you were originally. And if you then feel, okay, this is the point where I split, or this is the point where I stop, well, good enough too. And maybe at some other point, this part of the ecology that split will reconnect in a different situation, so on and so forth. So the idea of ecology is not trying to bypass the question of a common aim. It's trying to help people pose the question of common aim differently. One of the things that I say a few times in the book is, if there is a lesson in the book, it's not build an ecology, because the book assumes that an ecology always exists. It's think about what you're doing ecologically. Like, ask yourself, okay, what are the things that I can do in common with other people? Meaning not just common aims, but also, for example, resources. So the very material question of sharing resources that exist within the network. Which then gives an answer to your second question, which was, well, from the point of integration, this is, I mean, at the very basic point, why do I say ecology? At the very basic, and why do I say you belong to an ecology with other people, whether you're aware of them or not? Well, because all of you are acting on the same environment, and therefore, by transforming the environment, you are transforming the affordances, the possibilities for action that are available to each one of you. So you might not even know a lot of these people, but you are connected to them somehow. This is a very low level of integration. And obviously, when we overlay the question of the ecology with the question of common aims, not just trying to survive and reproduce, we're also trying to do things. Then that generates the question of, well, who further integrates, who takes on the task to further integrate the ecology and who takes on the task to further integrate the ecology by strategizing it, by, trying to find common strategies that would work within that ecology? Well, the answer to that is in what I just said, when I said that the lesson of the book was ultimately think about what you're doing ecologically. Ideally, who does that work? Everyone. Ideally, this would be done, everyone would be capable of doing that. And I use a footballing metaphor, which doesn't work in the United States, but in Italy, you all understand what I'm talking about. Ideally, in a team, you don't want the team to be everyone doing their own thing, and you don't want the team to be entirely dependent on one player who organizes the game. You want every player to be capable of reading the game and taking position accordingly to what everyone else is doing. So the ideal scenario would be this. Obviously, it's not always this. It probably can't ever be this. But that was part of the intervention that I was trying to make with the book. It's like raise this problem to more people so that more people, and instead of, what we grew up with when we were doing politics 20 years ago, which is like strategy is bad. Oh, this person is talking about strategy. They must be closet Stalinists. Only Stalinists talk about strategy. What I'm doing with the book is everyone should be talking strategy. Everyone should be thinking about this and thinking about this in relation to the ecology within, in relation to the aims they have, the ecology within their acting, and the degrees of commonality they will have with different, in those aims that they will have with different actors within that ecology. So in response to one of the problems that Marco raised, I still see those two poles, vertical and horizontal, existing in the world. I would say, yes, that's exactly why I was writing the book. I was trying to ease them into a, not an early death because they've lasted for a while, but, and I am trying to ease them into dying sooner rather than later. This was why I was trying to intervene precisely in the middle of the debate and try and point out the ways in which the oppositions with which they were working struck me as unnecessary and counterproductive, but also that there would be ways of framing the problems with which they were working that could be common to both sides. So I am trying to unmake binaries that still objectively exist in the world, but the book is a contribution towards that, I hope. But it's interesting that Marco said something about he raised the question of intentionality, the intentionality of the actors, and how the ecological perspective that I'm taking seems to be taking an external, the perspective of an external observer, which is precisely one of the things that I criticize in the book in terms of earlier attempts to bring complexity into, and the scientific discourse on self-organization into the question of political organization. You said, the way you're describing it, if you're describing it as something where like the common aim just, spontaneously emerges, or, that it's just self-forming and self-maintaining in an optimal way, then it sounds very much like the market. And at the moment, I thought of countering, well, it also sounds very much like the multitude in Hart and Negri's terms, which was an earlier attempt to solve the same questions by bringing in the discussion on complexity, but failed, I think, precisely because it was looking at organization from this outsider, this external observer perspective. So it was describing this perfect system from the outside. And the way I describe what I'm doing in the book, right at the start, is saying I wanted to bring the first person perspective back into the discussion of self-organization. What does self-organization look like to an actor within a self-organizing system? And the answer is organization. That's what it looks like. You know, it's you acting in concerted ways with others to influence the behaviors of others. Like you can't predict from within the system what will emerge, but you can act in ways that, you know, the two extremes, which we had until now, I would say, until the third option that I tried to propose with the book, would have been you can either build an actor that is as strong, that is on the same scale as the actor that as what you're trying to destroy, or you just resign yourself to a very small scale and hope that actions at the very small scale will eventually click into a challenge to this thing that you're trying to fight. So the first option would be the party, the workers' movement, as it was originally conceived. The other one would be precisely what happens with the discussion on organization in this interval that Lele was talking about between the 80s and more or less now, when self-organization is used to preempt the question of political organization in many ways, precisely by taking this external observer position rather than saying, well, if we are within a self-organizing system, then we must act according to that, rather than just, you know, oh, let's do things at a very local scale and hope for the best. So I guess that would cover, and I think that already gives you an idea of what the answer on the question of convergence would be. I mean, I think it's definitely a much more useful way of talking about these things than unity, because precisely convergence expresses a unity that comes in degrees. You know, you converge and diverge to some degree, and you can converge at some point and diverge later. I think maybe we still talk about these convergences in two abstract ways. This would lead us back to the question about organizing material relations. I think the questions we have to ask of each other are still too abstract when we're thinking about convergence. It's still too much, what is common in our struggles? What is the common enemy that we have? When it should be, and it could be a lot more concrete. It's like, okay, here's a list of enemies. Let's decide which order we're taking them. Let's decide within what time scale and how. And let's pool our resources to take them down one by one. But, you know, I'd say convergence is, to me, sounds like a step in the right direction. On Extinction Rebellion, that's I've been, and the equivalent in Germany, which is called Last Generation. Extinction Rebellion kind of really appeared while I was in the process of writing the book already, and at that point, and I had very little time to work on the book. So at that time I thought, yeah, I'm dealing with this later. I'm not going to worry about it now, which is a shame because it struck me afterwards that there is the steps towards the conversation about like, this Extinction Rebellion model are already there. I propose the idea of the platform as being like the characteristic, a characteristic not in the sense that it's the dominant, and you know, I don't want to make the argument that any form is dominant because I'm actually arguing for a plurality of forms. But it's definitely the one that's the most characteristic of our time. And you know, you can establish a neat correlation with the form of capitalist organization, which is the most characteristic of our time, which is the platform. So it's platforms on both sides. What do I mean by platform as a model for political organization? It's basically a model where an initial organizing core sets up the basic framework for cooperation and then invite people to come and cooperate within that. If you think about the cycle of struggles of the last decade, even the protests that were characteristic of the cycle of struggle could be described as platforms. There were some people who decided what the date was, where people were going to meet, where they were going to try and march to. But the idea was, well, you come, you bring your own placard with your own slogan. There is no general banner that people are operating under, or we'll try to work out in the process if there's going to be a general banner. Now, the platform exists on a sliding scale or on a spectrum of how defined or how open the parameters for cooperation are. These protests would be examples of something that's very open. And I think then you run the risk of something that definitely happened in Brazil, possibly was the thing that happened in the Ukraine with Euromaidan. I say possibly because I'm not super well informed about what happened there, where the platform cooperation is so open that there are opportunistic elements in the far right who might try to jump in and hijack those things in their favor. Extinction Rebellion is on the opposite end of that. And it's interesting that you described it as top-down, because this is one of the most interesting things about Extinction Rebellion for me, which is very new, that its initial ask, its plausible promise, which is an expression that people in the tech world use to describe precisely this process of setting up a framework for cooperation and then offering it to people, come and cooperate in my platform. One of the things that's interesting about it, that's completely new, is that, you know, whereas in the last decade, it was part of the plausible promise that you had to tell people, oh yeah, we're completely open. There's absolutely no leaders. No one is deciding anything, which, you know, within 10 minutes, a good observer could look and say, it's not quite true. What's fascinating about Extinction Rebellion is their plausible promise to people is, come and collaborate with us and be our base. We're your leaders. You're not being invited to take part in any strategy discussions. We decide the strategy. You're being invited to execute it. And people go for it. And I think there are lots of very good reasons why people go for it. One is like the part of the frustration that came with the last decade when people realized, people went from, oh yes, now we have thousands of people in a square and we can finally decide the strategy of the revolution. And then they realized, oh no, you can't. It's very difficult to decide even who's cleaning the toilets when you have 1,000 people discussing. So there is frustration with that, and lots of people are very willing to just delegate strategic thinking to someone who seems to have a plan and has a good story to tell about the plan, and the plan seems reasonable, etc. The other thing is, it's actually a very adequate form of organization to the world we're in. Everyone is super precarious, time poor. You don't have time to be in endless meetings discussing strategy. So lots of people think, well, I still want to do something, but that horizontal form of organization, it demanded too much of me. It demanded stuff, and that was always one of the problems with horizontalism, is this blindness to the fact that actually you can only really do it in very extraordinary situations unless the world around you changes very fast, because people will have jobs, people will have families. You end up selecting a very particular kind of people who are young, who have lots of time on their hands, i.e. undergraduates and graduate students, which, great as they are clearly not enough to make a revolution with. And yeah, I think it's very interesting. It's very, as Lévi-Strauss would say, it's very bon à penser, this phenomenon of Extinction Rebellion. It's very good to think with, because I think it's very revealing of lots of things, of where we're at. Which finally takes me to the big questions. That not that these weren't big and great, but the really thorny and really sharp interventions that Sandro made about the book. I'll start with the one that's really burning a hole in me right now, which is this observation, which I'd seen a couple of people make already, and I was like, what are you talking about? That was not what I did. And then now I'm beginning to think, yeah, maybe I didn't want to, but I ended up doing that, which is the observation about the potentia potestas binary perhaps being the only one that I'm not willing to let go of. And I think maybe one of the things, I definitely feel now that I went through that too fast. And I probably had, by the end of the book, I had a different way of framing that question than I had at the start, but I didn't go back and change it. And probably it's not only the one unexamined binary in the book, but it's also, I would say, the last piece of faithfulness to the work of Negri, to his reading of Spinoza that I have in the book. I distanced myself a lot over the years from his reading of Spinoza, which was very formative for me. But maybe that was one element that was left. And I now regret it somewhat. I regret having gone through it too fast. Because I would still defend the binary, but I would defend the binary in different terms now and with more nuance. The way in which I would pose the question now, or I would pose the opposition now. And it's interesting because in a way it's already there in that passage, but it's not, I didn't tease it out. Is that potestas should be understood as externalized potentia. So potestas is just more stable forms. It's just the stabilization of forms of cooperation that become externalized from potentia in the sense that they become stabilized, they become crystallized, they are left over from the initial investment in creating them. And on the one hand, they have the advantage, at least while they are still invested by potentia, i.e. while they're still invested by people's collective capacity to act, they have the advantage of functioning as multipliers. So, you know, to think of something, a very simple example of potestas, a phone bank, which, you know, in anarchist organization, the anarchist groups that I've known would probably never consider of creating something like a phone bank. But a phone bank is a very useful thing. You know, you have in one place the contacts to all your, maybe nowadays they all have that because it's very easy to set up that with a Telegram group or a WhatsApp group. But it's basically, you know, you have a way of communicating to everyone who's in your sphere of influence all at once. That's a great example of potestas in the sense that it is an externalization of something, and potestas as a multiplier of potentia. You know, you can reach everyone at once, which is much easier than calling each person or, you know, seeking out each person and talking to them individually. The problem is, so in that way, yes, like to pose the problem of organization is to pose the problem of potestas as well, because it is to pose the problem of, you know, these more stabilized forms of constraint that we use to multiply our collective capacity to act. The problem is there is a limit after which these forms of potestas may turn against potentia, may become inhibiting factors to action, say the police, or, you know, the secret police in a workers' state. Initially, you might think, oh, the secret police is a great form of potestas because, you know, it smashes the class enemy. But then the enemy becomes you, and then that form of potestas becomes an inhibiting factor. So I would rephrase the problem now as saying not simply an opposition between potentia and potestas, but an opposition between potentia and forms of potestas that enhance potentia and forms of potestas that are inhibiting factors. So the difference, the line no longer cuts between potentia potestas, the line cuts between two forms of potesta, I would say. And I think that is how I would solve the question. I don't seem to have time for the other questions, though.
But we will have time for lunch or anything.
I will not have time for lunch.
Yeah.
So what we do, we stop here?
I would suggest so, but yeah, and then you know, we have a few days.
Exactly, there'll be time,
You
and hopefully with you all as well.
Guys, thank you so much. Thanks a lot also to people who followed via Teams. And those who want to stay for lunch, just let me know and we'll try to organize something.